The most important person in the room was the only one not allowed to cry. As the string quartet began the processional, Elena pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the kitchen door's porthole window. On the other side, in a blur of white silk and sunlight, her son took his first step toward a future she was hired to serve, but forever forbidden to join. 28 years ago, she signed a single piece of paper. Tonight, she would fulfill the contract by silently plating his wedding cake. This is Elena. For the past 3 decades, she's built a life around a single sacred rule: never look back. She surrendered her newborn son for adoption in the summer of 1996, believing it was the only way to give him a better life. She never expected to see him again. But a last-minute catering job for Savannah's most prestigious wedding planner has just broken that rule in the most cruel and beautiful way possible. Because the groom, the man she is now professionally bound to serve, is the baby she once held for just 7 silent minutes. 1996 was the year of quiet goodbyes. Elena was 22, working double shifts at a diner off the interstate, when she discovered she was pregnant. The father, a charming but transient musician, had left town with his band before she could even tell him. She had a faded studio apartment, a stack of unpaid bills, and a profound fear that her own unstable childhood was the only inheritance she could offer a child. Adoption, presented by a well-meaning social worker, felt less like a choice and more like an act of desperate love. She selected the parents from a portfolio: a smiling lawyer and his wife, a teacher who lived in a brick house with a swing set in the photograph. She named him Daniel for her grandfather, a name she whispered once into his soft hair before letting him go. The grief, as adoption psychologists note, did not end with the signing of papers. It transformed into a constant, low hum in the background of her life. For years, she battled what therapists later identify as a persistent, ambiguous loss, a lifetime of wondering and worrying that many birth mothers report. She channeled that energy into building something tangible. She saved every tip, every extra dollar, and enrolled in culinary school. By 2008, Elena's Table was a respected, if small, catering company known for its meticulous pastry work and silent, efficient staff. The work suited her. In the kitchen, every emotion had a place. Grief could be kneaded into dough, anxiety whipped into a meringue. The professional rule was simple: you are a warm, neutral presence. You are part of the scenery. It was the perfect career for a woman who had already mastered the art of disappearing. For decades, she kept her promise to herself. She never searched, but the universe, it seemed, had a different timeline. In the spring of 2023, a prestigious wedding planner, desperate after a last-minute vendor cancellation, called Elena's Table for a weekend wedding at the Grand Forsyth Park mansion. The budget was astronomical, the client demanding. Elena, needing the revenue to finally expand her kitchen, accepted. The contract arrived. The names of the clients were typically listed at the top: the Anderson family, hosting the marriage of their daughter, Chloe, to Daniel Mitchell. The name was a common one, Daniel Mitchell. It sent a jolt through her, but she dismissed it as coincidence, a phantom pain from an old wound. She buried herself in the logistics: the menu for 300, the imported flowers for the cake, the uniform requirements for her team. It wasn't until the week of the wedding, during the final walkthrough, that she saw the framed engagement photo on the planner's mood board. The groom was handsome, with dark hair and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes in the professional portrait, but it was the small, faint birthmark just below his left jawline that stopped the air in Elena's lungs. It was identical to her father's, a genetic signature she had passed on. A quiet panic set in. She considered backing out, fabricating an illness, but the penalty fee would bankrupt her business. She resolved to be a ghost, to delegate all front-of-house duties, to stay buried in the hot, anonymous safety of the kitchen. She told herself it was enough just to know he was happy, healthy, loved. She could be a silent witness to his joy from a distance. It was a fantasy, one of the first stages of any reunion, where the story we tell ourselves provides a fragile comfort. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright. Elena and her team arrived at the mansion at 5 a.m. Her sanctuary was the basement kitchen, a sprawling stainless steel labyrinth away from the main event space. As the hours bled away, the house above them came alive with the sounds of celebration: laughter, string quartets, the clink of champagne flutes. Elena worked with a mechanical precision, her hands steady even as her mind raced. She piped rosettes of buttercream, each one perfect, each one a tiny monument to the moment she was missing upstairs. Then at 3:45 in the afternoon, the wedding coordinator burst into the kitchen, her headset crackling. The lead server for the head table had slipped on the terrace and sprained an ankle. They were one person short for the most critical service of the night. Before Elena could protest, the coordinator pointed directly at her. You know the plating specs. You're drafted. Put on a clean coat and get to the service station in the main hall. Now. Fate had just overridden her carefully laid plans. There was no refusing without causing a scene that would draw far more attention. With numb hands, Elena swapped her stained chef's coat for a pristine white serving jacket. She took a deep breath, the same one she used to take before facing a row of demanding food critics, and pushed through the double doors. The grand hall was a vision of white orchids and candlelight, and there, at the center of it all, standing at the head table with his beautiful new bride, was Daniel. He was laughing at a toast, his arm around Chloe's waist. He was so close she could see the distinct pattern of his tie, the way his hair curled at the nape of his neck, just like hers did. The world seemed to slow, the noise fading to a dull roar. She picked up a tray of champagne flutes from a sideboard, her professional autopilot engaging. She moved toward the head table, her eyes fixed on the crystal in her hands, a servant in the court of her own king. She served the bride's mother first, then the father of the groom. Then she was standing directly behind Daniel. She could smell his cologne. She placed a glass on the tablecloth beside his right hand, her own hand trembling so slightly only she could feel it. He half turned, offering a distracted, polite smile over his shoulder. "Thank you," he said, his voice warm and deep. It was the first word she had ever heard him speak. In that single, commonplace moment of gratitude meant for a stranger, 30 years of silence collapsed. She managed a tight, professional nod and retreated, her heart hammering against her ribs. She fled back to the kitchen, to the steaming sanctuary of the dish pit, leaning against a steel counter as the reality solidified. He was here, he was real. And he had no idea the woman who just handed him a drink was the reason he drew breath. The crisis, however, was just beginning, because as Elena struggled to regain her composure, the head pastry chef called out to her, his voice strained. "Elena, we have a problem. The groom's cake." The custom-made, three-tiered chocolate cake, decorated with edible replicas of musical notes for Daniel's supposed love of jazz, was beginning to list dangerously to one side. The internal support had shifted during transport. It was on the verge of a catastrophic collapse, minutes before it was to be wheeled out for the cutting ceremony. The entire wedding, the photographer, the videographer, 300 guests, all were waiting for this centerpiece. Elena stared at the listing tower of sugar and fondant, a symbol of the life she'd given him. Fixing it would require her to step back into the spotlight, to work under the gaze of the entire party, directly in front of him, but letting it fall would ruin his wedding day. She was trapped between the promise she made to stay invisible and the primal need to protect her child from any harm, even from a fallen cake. She had 5 minutes to decide. The choice was an illusion. There was no decision to make. A mother's reflex, buried for decades, fired before her mind could catch up. "Get me the spare dowels, the pastry glue, and a steady hand," Elena heard herself say, her voice oddly calm. "Clear a space on that counter. We have 3 minutes." What followed was a masterclass in high-pressure culinary triage, performed in a sweltering corner of the kitchen, while the band upstairs launched into an upbeat swing number. Elena's hands, which had trembled moments before, became instruments of perfect steadiness. She inserted new supports, applied strategic dots of edible adhesive, and reinforced the structure with an engineer's precision. Her team watched in silent awe. In 4 minutes and 22 seconds, the cake stood straight and proud, its near disaster invisible to anyone who hadn't witnessed the panic. The coordinator, wiping her brow, breathed, "You just saved this wedding." But the rescue came with a price. The coordinator insisted Elena personally oversee the cake's journey to the ballroom. "It's your work. You ensure it gets there. I can't risk another pair of hands." The professional curtain Elena had clung to was torn away. She would have to walk the cake into the heart of the celebration, directly toward him. Pushing the ornate silver cart, Elena felt like she was marching to her own execution. The ballroom doors swung open. A wave of light, music, and 300 faces turned toward her entrance. A spotlight, meant for the cake, caught her in its beam. She kept her eyes locked on the intricate musical notes she had piped days earlier, a false tribute to a hobby she knew nothing about. She guided the cart to the center of the dance floor, right beside the sweetheart table where Daniel and Chloe sat, holding hands. This was the closest she had been since serving the champagne. She could see the fine weave of his tuxedo, the way his new wedding band gleamed under the lights. She focused on locking the cart's brakes, her every movement slow and deliberate to hide the storm inside. As she finished, the master of ceremonies announced, "And now, the moment we've all been waiting for, the cutting of the groom's cake." The crowd cheered. Daniel stood, helping Chloe to her feet. He picked up the silver cake server, laughing at something his bride whispered in his ear. He turned and his eyes briefly scanned the staff around the cart, a perfunctory glance. They passed over Alina's face, over her chef's hat, and moved on without a flicker of recognition. The indifference was a physical blow. It was everything she had supposedly wanted, his uninterrupted happiness, free from the complication of her existence. Yet, in that moment, it felt like dying. The fantasy stage of reunion, where she imagined some subtle, cosmic connection, shattered against the hard reality of his unknowing gaze. She retreated to the periphery as the couple cut the first slice, the flash of cameras popping like fireworks. A server took over, plating pieces for the guests. Elena's official duty was done. She should have slipped back to the kitchen, vanished into the steam and the clatter of pans, but her feet were rooted to the polished floor. She found a shadowed alcove near a potted fern, a servant's vantage point, and simply watched. She drank in the sight of him like a woman in a desert finding water. She watched him feed Chloe a bite of cake, watched him throw his head back in genuine laughter at a friend's joke, watched him move through the room with an easy grace that spoke of a confident upbringing. Then, during the father-daughter dance, she overheard a conversation that changed everything. Two older women, aunts of the bride perhaps, were standing nearby, their voices hushed but carrying. "Chloe looks radiant, but have you seen Daniel's mother?" one said, sipping her wine. "Margaret, oh, she's holding court by the bar, you know her," the other replied with a dismissive wave. "All surface, no substance. Did you hear she tried to veto the band? Said jazz was too common for this crowd." "I'm not surprised. She's been controlling every detail. I heard from James that Daniel's relationship with her has been strained since his father passed. All about the family image, you know." Elena's blood ran cold. Margaret asterisk, the adoptive mother, the woman from the portfolio photo, now a real person holding court by the bar, a woman described as controlling, surface level. This was not the nurturing teacher mother Elena had painstakingly imagined for 3 decades. This was a socialite. A new sharp fear cut through her. Had she, in her desperate act of love, delivered her son into a gilded cage? The research on adoption outcomes whispered in her ear, openness leads to higher satisfaction. What kind of life had a closed adoption with a Margaret created? Her surveillance from the shadows took on a new, urgent focus. She scanned the room until she found her. Margaret Mitchell was a slim woman in a severe silver gown, her smile polished and unmoving as she accepted compliments. Her eyes constantly tracked Daniel, not with warmth, but with the appraisal of a curator checking a valuable exhibit. Elena saw Daniel approach her, lean down to say something. Margaret's response was a tight smile and a slight adjustment to his bow tie, a correction. Daniel's own smile faded just a fraction before he turned back to his guests. It was a tiny, devastating exchange. The perfect life Elena had clung to as justification for her sacrifice now showed its first hairline crack. The party rolled on, a relentless machine of joy. Elena was supposed to be coordinating the late-night slider station. Instead, she was a ghost in the corner, her professional facade crumbling under the weight of compounding revelations. She watched as an older man, perhaps Daniel's adoptive father's brother, clapped him on the back a little too hard. To the heir of the Mitchell fortune, the man boomed, his voice slurry. "Your dad would be proud and relieved. Now the company stays in the *right hands, eh?" Daniel's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. The smile he offered was pure duty. "Thank you, Uncle Robert." The exchange hinted at pressures, expectations, a legacy that was a burden, not a gift. The better life she had chosen for him was now revealing itself as a complex web of obligation and performance. A burning need seized Elena, a need she had suppressed for 30 years, to know him, not the symbol, not the fantasy, but the man. She began to piece together a profile from the fragments floating around her. He was a corporate lawyer like his adoptive father. He had gone to Vanderbilt. He played golf, not jazz. He had a rescued dog named Buddy. He hated oysters. Each piece of trivia was a treasure and a torture. She was learning the biography of a stranger who was her own flesh and blood. As the clock neared 10, the energy began to shift toward departure. The bride's gown was bustled for travel. Confetti was distributed. Elena knew her time was evaporating. Soon he would be gone, off to a honeymoon in Italy, back to a life in which she played no part, not even as a memory. A desperate, reckless thought began to form. What if she left a note? Something anonymous, tucked into his going-away bag. Just a simple, "Your birth mother wishes you a lifetime of happiness." No name, no contact, just the acknowledgement that she existed, that she was here, that she saw him. It was a terrible idea. It could shatter his world, anger his family, disrupt the very wedding she had just worked to save. The adoption reunion literature screamed warnings, differing expectations, the risk of rejection, the potential for psychological upheaval. Yet the urge to leave some tiny mark, to whisper into the void, "I was here," felt overwhelming. She was wrestling with this impulse when the final, cruel twist of the evening arrived. The wedding planner tracked her down, clutching a thick envelope. "Elena, there you are." The mother of the groom wanted to express her personal appreciation to the catering staff. She asked specifically for the chef who saved the cake. "Here." She thrust the envelope into Elena's hands. It was crisp, cream-colored, and sealed with a monogrammed M, Margaret Mitchell's personal stationery. Inside was not a letter, but a single thick card. It was a pre-printed thank you note. At the bottom, above the embossed name Margaret Mitchell, was a single sentence handwritten in elegant, icy blue ink. It read, "Your discretion and professionalism tonight were commendable. One hardly noticed you were there." It was the ultimate praise in her industry. It was also the most exquisite dismissal of her entire existence. She had been paid, thanked, and erased in one graceful stroke. The note slipped from Elena's fingers, fluttering to the floor just as the grand send-off began. The guests lined up, sparklers were lit, forming a glittering tunnel. Daniel and Chloe, hand in hand, ran laughing through the shower of light toward a waiting vintage car. Elena stood in the dark, outside the circle of light, the discarded note at her feet. She watched the car door close. She watched it pull away, the taillights disappearing into the savannah night. It was over, he was gone. She had borne witness, and it had broken her. The kitchen staff began the massive cleanup, the magic of the evening dissolving into the mundane reality of trash bags and soapy water. Elena moved through the motions, a shell. As her team loaded the last van, the wedding planner approached one final time. "Elena, fantastic work. Truly. Listen, Margaret Mitchell was so impressed, she wants to book you for her annual garden party next month. It's her biggest event of the year. She said to call her office Monday." The offer hung in the humid air, another entry into the Mitchell world, another chance to stand in the shadows and observe the life she had created and abandoned. It was an invitation to willingly re-enter the chamber of her own quiet torture, to become a permanent, silent fixture in the periphery of her son's world, a paid ghost. Elena got into her car, alone. The mansion, now dark and silent, loomed in her rearview mirror. She drove the streets of Savannah, not toward her small apartment, but aimlessly. The emotional labor of the night, the smiling, the suppressing, the professional calm, had depleted every reserve. She finally pulled over in a quiet square, the same kind of square where in another story, a different fate might have been found. She put her head against the steering wheel and wept great heaving sobs that had been stored for 30 years. She cried for the baby she let go. She cried for the man he became, who seemed loved yet observed, successful yet strained. She cried for the thank you note that praised her invisibility. When the tears finally subsided, leaving her raw and hollow, a new and dangerous emotion began to flicker in the emptiness, a sharp, maternal rage. Not at Daniel, never at him, but at Margaret. At the pristine, controlled world that had thanked her for being a non-entity. At the system that asked a mother to disappear and then praised her for doing it well. She picked up her phone. The glowing screen showed the saved contract for the wedding. Daniel Mitchell's contact information was listed under Groom, a personal cell number, an email address. It was there, a digital thread connecting her to him, a violation of 100 protocols and her own lifelong rule. Back at her apartment, the silence was deafening. The envelope with Margaret's note lay on her kitchen table, a white tombstone on the linoleum. She stared at Daniel's number on her screen. The research was clear: unplanned, unprepared reunions could be disastrous. The adoptee might want information, not a relationship. He had a mother, a wife, a life. But another voice, raw and primal, argued back. He also had a birthmark from a grandfather he never knew. He had a biological mother who thought of him every single day of his life. He had a right to know where he came from, especially if the world he was in was not entirely what it seemed. Elena's finger hovered over the screen. The cursor blinked in the message field. The grand, dramatic reunion of her fantasies was impossible, but a single sentence, a question sent into the void, something as simple as, "Daniel, this may come as a shock, but I believe I am your biological mother. I was the caterer at your wedding. I would like the chance to explain, if you are ever willing." To send it was to detonate a bomb in his life and in her own. To not send it was to condense herself forever into a footnote, a paid service provider praised for her discretion. The ghost would have to choose to remain a whisper or to find a voice. She took a deep, shuddering breath, and the choice before her was no longer about cake, but about truth. Her fingers slipped. It wasn't a dramatic press. It was a tremor of exhaustion, a final failure of will against gravity. The message, *Daniel, this may come as a shock*, flew into the digital ether. The moment the send graphic completed its animation, a wave of pure terror obliterated the rage and grief that had driven her. She threw the phone onto the sofa as if it were a live scorpion. What had she done? It was 4:17 in the morning. He was on his wedding night, possibly already on a plane to Italy. She had just injected a grenade into the happiest moment of his life. She scrambled to grab the phone, her hands slick with panic, searching for an unsend option that didn't exist. The message was delivered. Read receipts were off. She was now a prisoner of the unknown, waiting for a reply that might never come, or worse, one that would destroy her. For 36 hours, Elena existed in a state of suspended animation. She jumped at every notification, her heart slamming against her ribs, only to find a spam email or a text from her sous chef about a food order. She reread her own message 100 times, each time cringing at its clinical, terrifying bluntness. She imagined Daniel reading it on a sunny terrace in Positano, his new wife beside him, his world imploding. She imagined him deleting it, dismissing it as a cruel hoax. She imagined him showing it to Margaret, and a fresh dread, colder than the first, seized her. Margaret's reaction wouldn't be hurt, it would be a declaration of war. On the third day, as Elena was mechanically boxing pastries for a corporate breakfast, her phone buzzed with a new email. The sender address was a generic, impersonal string of numbers and letters. The subject line was blank. Her breath hitched. This was it, the summons or the condemnation. The body of the email contained no greeting, no signature, just a single stark line: Linden Square, bench by the fountain, tomorrow, 10 a.m., come alone. It was him, it had to be. The tone was cold, controlled, utterly devoid of the warmth she'd heard in his "thank you" at the wedding. This was the voice of a lawyer, not a son. The location was a public but quiet square in Savannah's historic district, a neutral, exposed territory. Come alone. The instruction felt less like a request for privacy and more like a security protocol. The reunion she had fantasized about for decades was now a tense, scheduled meeting that felt like a business negotiation or an ambush. She didn't sleep. She arrived at Linden Square at 9:45, her stomach a knot of twisted nerves. She chose a bench facing the fountain, her back to the sun, so she could see him approach. At exactly 10 o'clock, a figure appeared at the far end of the path. It was Daniel. He wore dark jeans and a navy sweater, sunglasses hiding his eyes. He moved with a deliberate, measured pace. He did not look like a groom fresh from a honeymoon. He looked like a man walking into a courtroom. He stopped in front of her bench, not sitting. He removed his sunglasses. His eyes, the same shade of hazel as her own, were red-rimmed and hard. The birthmark on his jaw seemed to stand out like a brand. "Elena," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd done his homework. He knew her name, her business. The power imbalance was total. Daniel, she managed, her voice a dry whisper. I am so sorry for the way I contacted you. There was no good way. He ignored the apology. The wedding, you were there, the cake. His voice was flat, analytical. You planned this. No, the word burst from her. God, no, it was a coincidence. The planner called me last minute. I didn't know it was you until I saw the photo, and even then I didn't believe it. I was going to stay in the kitchen. I never meant. To do what? He interrupted, his control slipping for a fraction of a second, revealing a flash of raw anger. To blow up my life? Do you have any idea what you've done? He finally sat, not next to her, but on the far end of the bench, putting maximum distance between them. The space felt like a chasm. He told her he'd received the message in the airport lounge during a layover in New York. Chloe had gone to buy a magazine. He'd read it, his first reaction one of bewildered disgust, a scam, a prank. But the specific detail, the caterer at your wedding, had lodged in his mind. He'd gone into a private corner and called his mother. Margaret's reaction had been instant, volcanic denial. It's a con artist, Daniel, a gold digger who saw your picture in the society pages. We will sue her for harassment, but her vehemence had felt off. It had the sharp tang of fear, not just outrage. Daniel, trained in spotting inconsistencies, had felt the first doubt. He'd spent the flight to Rome in a silent, seething turmoil, hiding it from his confused new wife. He'd used his firm's resources to discreetly pull the adoption records he'd never once asked to see. They were sealed, but his legal access provided a narrow window. The name of the birth mother was redacted, but the non-identifying information matched: age, physical description, occupation at the time of surrender. Food service, he'd cross-referenced it with the catering contract for his wedding. Elena's table, owner, Elena Vasquez, age 52. My mother, he said, the word mother dripping with a new, complicated bitterness, is currently insisting we retain a litigator to send you a cease and desist. She's calling it emotional extortion. She says you're a threat to our family. Elena felt the bench tilt beneath her. This was the nightmare scenario. She wasn't being met with curiosity or a longed-for connection. She was being treated as a hostile entity, a lawsuit in an apron. The research had warned of this. The adoptee might feel ambushed, their identity under attack. I don't want anything from you, Elena said, forcing her voice to steady. Not money, not a relationship you don't want. You had a right to know I existed, that you have a medical history of a face somewhere that belongs to you. After seeing her, she trailed off, afraid to voice her criticisms of Margaret. Daniel studied her, his lawyer's mask back in place. Why now, after 30 years? It was the question she dreaded, how to explain a lifetime of grief in a public square. Because I saw you, she said simply, and you were a phantom my whole life, and then you were real, and you said thank you to me, and it was the first and last thing you'll ever say to me. I couldn't carry that silence anymore. It was a selfish act, I own that. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the plash of the fountain. Some of the rigid anger seemed to seep from Daniel's shoulders. He looked down at his hands. She never wanted me to know, he said, his voice quieter now. It was a closed adoption. That was the agreement. A clean break, she always said. Any curiosity I had as a kid was shut down, politely, firmly. It was a non-topic. He finally looked at her, and the confusion in his eyes was more painful than the anger. She told me my birth mother was a college student who made a brave choice, not a chef. I was a diner waitress, Elena corrected softly. The chef part came later. She offered a tiny, fragile piece of her true history, a correction, not a demand. He nodded, absorbing this. Then he asked the question that had clearly been burning in him. Who was my father? Elena told him about the musician, the little she knew. It was a pathetic, brief story. Daniel listened, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he said, so it was just an accident, a mistake. The word hung in the air, defining his own origin. No, Elena said, her voice fierce for the first time. You were never a mistake. The circumstances were a mess. I was a mess. But choosing the adoption in my heart, that was an act of hope. I chose the portfolio with the swing set. I chose what I thought was safety, stability. She met his gaze. Did you have a swing set? A ghost of a smile, sad and ironic, touched his lips. "We had a perfectly manicured lawn, no swing set. It would have cluttered the vista." He quoted Margaret's phrase with a familiar, weary resentment. In that moment, Elena saw not a hostile lawyer, but the little boy whose curiosity had been politely boxed away. The boy from the portfolio who never got his swing set. The meeting lasted 20 minutes. It ended not with a hug or tears, but with a tense, verbal agreement. He would call off Margaret's lawyers for now. She would make no further contact unless he initiated it. He needed time, space, to process, to deal with Chloe, who was currently bewildered and hurt in a Roman hotel room, to face Margaret. As he stood to leave, he paused. "The cake was excellent," he said, not looking at her. "It was the only part of the reception that didn't feel pre-approved." Then he put his sunglasses back on and walked away, leaving Elena on the bench, clutching that single, backhanded compliment like a lifeline. But the storm, as they often do, had simply changed direction. Elena returned to her kitchen, a strange numbness settling over her. She had made contact. He hadn't rejected her outright. It was more than she'd ever allowed herself to hope for. She focused on work, on the calming ritual of sugar and flour. She did not call Margaret's office about the garden party. 5 days later, the storm made landfall. It arrived not with a phone call from Daniel, but with a certified letter and a visit from the city health department. The letter was from Mitchell Family Holdings, LLC. It cited a breach of client confidentiality and alleged harassing conduct by a principal of Elena's table toward a family member. It strongly suggested that Elena voluntarily surrender her business license to avoid a lengthy and public litigation that would undoubtedly destroy your professional reputation. It was a threat wrapped in legalese, and it bore Margaret Mitchell's unmistakable stamp. Simultaneously, a health inspector arrived, responding to an anonymous tip about rodent activity and unsafe food handling at Elena's commercial kitchen, a kitchen that had always received perfect scores. The inspector was thorough, disruptive, and found nothing, but the damage was done. The visit lasted 3 hours during peak prep time, forcing Elena to cancel 2 afternoon deliveries. Word began to spread in the tight-knit catering community. Elena's table was under scrutiny. Margaret was making good on her promise. She wasn't just defending her family, she was orchestrating Elena's professional annihilation. This was the "it gets worse" moment. The emotional confrontation was now a brutal, real-world fight for survival. Elena's life's work, the empire she'd built from her grief, was on the chopping block. As she stared at the legal letter, her fear finally crystallized into a cold, clear resolve. She would not be erased again, not by forms, not by guilt, and not by a wealthy woman protecting a facade. She called her own lawyer, a pragmatic local attorney who'd done her incorporation paperwork. "I need to fight this," Elena said, her voice steady. Her lawyer was cautious. "Fighting the Mitchells is expensive, Elena. They can delay and motion until you're bankrupt. Sometimes it's better to settle, to walk away quietly." "I've been walking away quietly for 30 years, Elena replied. "Not this time." She began to assemble her defense. She gathered every document from the wedding, the contract, the emails, the time-stamped photos of her team working. She wrote a meticulous statement about the cake incident, framing it as professional duty, not premeditation. It was a weak position, but it was something. What she didn't know was that Daniel's time to process was unraveling another thread in the Mitchell tapestry. Back from his abbreviated, tense honeymoon, he had confronted Margaret. According to the fractured version of events Elena would later piece together, it had been a monumental clash. Daniel had demanded the full, unredacted adoption file. Margaret had refused, citing the sacred agreement. Daniel had accused her of caring more about the agreement than about him. In a heated moment, Margaret had let slip a devastating truth. "We never would have been approved if they knew about the depression. Your father's episodes. We presented a perfect front, and we gave you a perfect life. This woman, she's trying to tarnish that, to take what's ours." Daniel had heard the confession in her words, the perfect front. The portfolio had been a performance. The adoption itself may have been secured under somewhat falsified pretenses, hiding the very human flaws in the Mitchell household. The foundation of his identity, the narrative of being chosen by a perfect couple, cracked wide open. A week after the health inspection, as Elena was preparing her legal response, her phone rang. An unknown number. She answered, bracing for another threat. It was Daniel. His voice was different. Stripped of the loyally coldness, it was just tired, sad, and urgent. "Elena, we need to talk, not in a square, somewhere private. Can I come to you?" The battle lines had just been redrawn. The sun was reaching out, not as an adversary, but as an ally. And the war for the truth was no longer just about the past. It was about who would control the future. He arrived at her apartment with a folder, not flowers. Daniel stood in Elena's small living room, a space dominated by cookbooks and the faint, sweet smell of vanilla. The distance between the Forsyth Park mansion and this modest apartment was more than just miles. He looked out of place, but he also looked, for the first time, real. The polished Groom was gone, replaced by a man weighed down by a truth he was still learning to carry. "She lied," he said without preamble, placing the folder on her coffee table. "Not just by omission. The adoption agency's file. My father, he had a documented history of severe depressive episodes, hospitalizations. They listed him as stable, professional on the home study. My mother knew. She coached him through the interviews. They presented a perfect front because they were desperate for a child. The swing set in the photo wasn't even in their yard. It was a stock image." Elena listened, her heart breaking for the second time for the same child. The better life had been built on a foundation of careful fiction. Daniel's perfect world was a beautifully staged set. "When I confronted her with this," Daniel continued, his voice tight, "she didn't deny it. She said everything they did was to give me opportunities she never had, that the ends justified the means. And then she said you were a threat to the family's reputation, that you used this information." He looked at Elena, his eyes searching hers. "Are you?" "No," Elena said, the words solid and final. "That's not why I reached out. That's her asterisk language, not mine. My only goal was to be seen by you, just once." Daniel nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself. He opened the folder. It contained the cease and desist letter from the family lawyer. "I've spoken to the firm. This action is withdrawn. My mother no longer has the authority to initiate legal proceedings on behalf of the family or the holding company." He paused. "I've temporarily assumed control of the family's legal affairs. My father's condition, it's worse than I knew. She's been managing everything, and it's unsustainable." The power dynamic had inverted. The son was now the gatekeeper. "What about the health department?" Elena asked. "The anonymous tip has been formally retracted. I handled it." He said it with a quiet efficiency that was intimidating. This was the corporate lawyer, the heir, using his tools not to destroy, but to clean up a mess. "Your business is safe, Elena," from her. The relief was so profound, it felt like a physical unclenching, but it was followed by a heavier silence. The external threat was neutralized. Now they were just two people in a quiet room, connected by biology and a shared hurricane of disruption. "Chloe knows everything," Daniel said, filling the quiet. "It was hard, but she's my wife. She deserved the truth. She's angry, but not at you, at the situation, at the lies." He managed a faint, pained smile. "She said the cake really was excellent." A small, fragile bridge was built. They talked for 2 hours, not as mother and son, but as two survivors of the same earthquake, comparing notes. He asked practical questions about family medical history. She asked gentle questions about his life, his real hobbies, his dog Buddy, his favorite food. It was, ironically, her signature salted caramel brownie. It was an exchange of information, the first stage of any reunion where facts act as a safe proxy for emotion. He did not call her mom. She did not expect him to. The research was clear. He already had a mother, however flawed. What was forming was something new, undefined, and fragile. As he left, he hesitated at the door. "The garden party," he said. "She's still expecting you to cater it." Elena's blood ran cold. The idea of walking back into Margaret's world, under her scrutiny, was unthinkable. "I can't." "I think you should," Daniel said, his tone shifting back to strategic. "But not as her caterer, as my guest." He met her stunned gaze. "It's time the perfect front saw what it's been hiding from, on my terms." The following month was a tense ceasefire. Elena did not call Margaret's office. Margaret, stripped of her legal leverage and facing a son who was suddenly an adversary, did not call her. Elena focused on her business, the normalcy of flour and butter a solace. Daniel texted occasionally, a photo of Buddy, a question about a recipe for Chloe. The connection was thin, a spider's thread, but it held. The day of the Mitchell garden party dawned oppressively hot. The event was the social highlight of Margaret's year, a display of wealth and influence on the sweeping lawns of their country club. Elena did not arrive with the catering vans. She arrived in a taxi, wearing a simple linen dress, her hands empty of trays. Daniel met her at the entrance. He looked tense but resolute. "Stay close to me," he said quietly. "She knows you're coming." They walked onto the lawn together. The scene was a mirror of the wedding, the same elegant crowd, the same aura of moneyed perfection. Heads turned immediately. The appearance of the son with an unknown, plainly dressed woman sparked a ripple of curiosity. Elena saw Margaret across the lawn, holding a crystal glass of iced tea. Margaret's face, for one unguarded second, was a mask of pure, icy fury before it smoothed into a hostess's polite inquiry. Margaret glided over, the crowd parting for her. "Daniel, darling, and Miss Vasquez, what a surprise." Her voice was sweet as poisoned honey. "Mother," Daniel said, his arm lightly touching Elena's back in a gesture of clear alliance. "Elena is my guest. I thought it was time she saw where her contribution ended up." The double meaning hung in the humid air, contribution asterisk. Her DNA, her son. Margaret's eyes flashed, but her smile remained. "How thoughtful. Well, welcome. Do enjoy the canapés. I believe they're from Le Solal asterisk. We use only the best." A deliberate, cutting reminder of Elena's displaced role. As the party swirled, Elena felt like an exhibit. Daniel stayed by her side, introducing her simply as Elena, a friend, which only fueled speculation. She saw the calculating looks, heard the whispers. She was an anomaly in the perfect picture, a crack in the veneer. And that, she realized, was exactly Daniel's point. Her presence was his statement. The hidden past was now a visible, unignorable part of his present. The confrontation, when it came, was not a screaming match. It was quieter and more devastating. Margaret cornered Elena near a blooming hydrangea while Daniel was pulled away by a business associate. "You think you've won," Margaret said, her voice low and venomous. "You think showing up here playing the victim changes anything. He is my son, I raised him, I made him who he is. You are a footnote, a biological detail." Elena, who had spent a lifetime shrinking, found a strength she didn't know she had. She looked Margaret directly in the eyes. "You're right, you raised him, and from what I see, that meant teaching him to hide, to perform, to value Vista over swing sets. I gave him life. You gave him a script. He's throwing the script away, Margaret, and you can't stand it." Margaret recoiled as if slapped. The perfect mask finally crumbled, revealing the terrified woman beneath, a woman who had built a castle on sand and saw the tide coming in. She had no retort. She simply turned and walked away, her posture rigid with defeat. Daniel found Elena a few minutes later. "You okay?" She nodded. "It's done." He smiled, a real, unburdened smile she'd never seen before. "Good. Let's get out of here. There's a dog who wants to meet you." They left the garden party together, walking past the staring guests, past the hired staff from Le Solal asterisk. Elena did not look back. This time, she was not leaving in the shadows. She was leaving in the light beside her son. The relationship that unfolded was not a storybook ending. It was slow, awkward, and carefully negotiated. Elena became Elena, a special family friend. She had dinner with Daniel and Chloe every other week. She taught Chloe how to make her brownies. Buddy, the rescue dog, took a shining to her and would sleep at her feet. Daniel began asking more questions about her life, her family. She showed him pictures of her parents, his biological grandparents. He listened, his lawyer's mind cataloging a history that was now his own. One evening, as they cleaned up after dinner, he said, without looking at her, "You know, I always hated jazz. I only said I liked it because it was in my father's profile. I prefer classic rock." Elena laughed, a true, free laugh. "I know, your real father played a mean air guitar to Led Zeppelin." It was a tiny, shared secret, a piece of truth replacing a piece of fiction. Margaret's garden party was the last public event she hosted. Shortly after, Daniel and Chloe helped his father move into a specialized care facility for his depression. Margaret retreated from public view, the architecture of her perfect life quietly dismantled. 8 months after the wedding, Elena received a formal invitation in the mail, not for a catering job, it was to a housewarming. Daniel and Chloe had bought a modern, comfortable home in a friendly neighborhood. The backyard, the invitation photo showed, had a brand new, brightly colored swing set. Elena arrived with a housewarming gift, a framed vintage recipe card for her brownies. As she walked through the new house, she saw a few familiar faces from the wedding, friends who had embraced the complicated new reality. Then in the living room she saw it. On a bookshelf, nestled between legal volumes and travel guides, was a small framed photograph. It was a picture of the three of them, Daniel, Chloe, and Elena, taken at one of their dinners, all caught in a moment of genuine laughter. It was not displayed prominently, but it was there, acknowledged, integrated. She was not the mother, she was not the caterer, she was something else entirely, a piece of his story that was no longer hidden, no longer a secret. She was a truth reconciled. Later, as the sun set, Daniel found her on the back porch, looking at the swing set. He handed her a glass of lemonade. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" she asked. "For not giving up," he said. "For sending that text. For being brave enough to break the silence, even though it was messy and painful. It was the bravest thing anyone has ever done for me." Elena looked at her son, her eyes brimming. The ghost had found a voice, and the voice, however quiet, had been heard. The most important person in the room was finally allowed to be there. And for the first time in 30 years, she felt no need to cry. She simply smiled and took his hand and watched the future begin to swing gently in the twilight. Elena's story is not about a secret revealed, but a silence broken. For 30 years, she lived with the quiet, unspoken truth that psychologists call an ambiguous loss, a grief with no closure, a love with no destination. We often think of adoption as a single moment of surrender, but for the birth mother, it is the beginning of a lifetime of wondering. Research tells us that a staggering 90% of birth mothers feel deeply harmed by the adoption, their pain increasing, not fading, with time. Elena carried that weight, transforming it into the precise craft of her kitchen, until the day fate placed her son in her line of sight. What she faced in that mansion was more than a personal shock. It was a collision with the entire architecture of closed adoption, a system built on the promise of a clean break, but which often leaves jagged edges on both sides of the divide. She saw the product of her sacrifice, a successful man in a tailored suit, yet one who moved through a world of performative perfection, who had been taught that curiosity about his origins was a threat to the family vista. The reunion, when it came, was not the fairy tale we might imagine. It was messy, legalistic, and fraught with the fear of rejection. It followed the documented stages, fantasy, first encounter, the painful morning after, and required both parties to navigate a road for which there was no map. But within that messiness lies the real miracle, not a sudden mother-son bond, but the courageous, incremental construction of something true. Daniel didn't gain a new mother that day, he gained a missing chapter of his own biography. Elena didn't regain a son, she regained her right to exist in his story. They built, brick by careful brick, a new category of relationship, one defined not by the roles they were assigned, but by the honest connection they chose to forge. This story asks us to look beyond the surfaces of the lives around us. The server at your event, the cleaner in your office, the stranger passing you on the street, each carries an invisible history of love and loss that could rewrite your own. Redemption is rarely a grand, sweeping gesture. More often, it's a series of small, terrifying choices: to send a text, to ask a question, to show up at a garden party, to build a swing set. It is the decision to exchange a perfect lie for an imperfect truth. Elena and Daniel's journey reminds us that the most profound human connections are often waiting in the quiet spaces we're most afraid to enter. That the price of truth, however high, is never as costly as a lifetime lived in the silent service of a secret. If this story of a hidden love and a courageous reunion resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. For more documentaries that explore the unseen threads connecting our lives, remember to subscribe and join us for the next emotional journey. Until then, look a little closer. The most important story in the room might be the one no one is